Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are diving into the subcontracting process in SAP MM. Now this is the fourth video in our series on special procurement processes in SAP MM module. If you have been following this series, you have already seen our previous three videos on the consignment process, blanket purchase order process and service procurement process. But if you haven't watched them yet, then I have added the links in the description below. Make sure to check them out. Now let's dive into today's topic, that is the subcontracting process in SAP MM. In this video, we'll walk through the subcontracting process using a real-world business scenario and cover the complete end-to-end cycle in SAP. We'll also break down the financial entries involved in this process, and to help you prepare for interviews, we'll wrap up with some important interview questions on this topic. So make sure to stick around till the end to get a complete understanding. Now let's get started. Now let's take a business scenario. Let's say that your plant manufactures bicycles, but your plant does not have the facility to paint them. So in order to get them painted, you send these bicycles to a vendor, which then paints these bicycles and sends the bicycles back to your plant. Okay. Now if you see this whole process, it appears to be a service purchase order. Okay, because you're only paying the vendor for the service charges that is incurred while painting these bicycles. The vendor is not providing you any material. The vendor is simply doing a service activity on your raw bicycles and providing you the painted bicycles. Now, if you follow the service procurement route for this particular activity, then the main problem with that route will be that the inventory management of these bicycles will not be possible. That is, you will not be able to track down how many raw bicycles you have in your warehouse, how many painted bicycles you have received from the vendor. So although this whole process appears to be a service procurement process, but this also involves inventory management activities. You need to issue your raw bicycles to the vendor, and then you need to receive the painted bicycles from the vendor through a purchase order by doing a GR. Okay. So this kind of a special procurement process can be done through something called as a subcontracting process in SAP MM. SAP has provided a special procurement process where you will be issuing the raw bicycles to the vendor and receiving the painted bicycles from the vendor to your plant inventory. And in this process, you will be paying for the service charges that has been incurred while doing this activity. So in a subcontracting process, what you will do is you will issue these raw bicycles to the vendor, and in your inventory, these raw bicycles will be seen under the vendor's stock. Then once the vendor does the painting activity, then it will supply you the painted bicycles, and then you will do the GR for these painted bicycles and then process payment for the service charges. So it is a kind of a combination of a material PO and a service PO, where you issue the components to a vendor and then you receive the finished goods and then you pay the service charges to the subcontractor. So what is a subcontracting process? A subcontracting process involves sending raw materials, or in SAP we call it components, to a supplier. Now the supplier will use these components to manufacture the finished product. In this case, the finished product is a painted bicycle and the raw material is a raw bicycle. Now although the vendor is asked to perform services in this process, as I have explained, but this also involves inventory management. So you need a special procurement process, which we'll call in SAP as a subcontracting process. And now we'll see what all steps are required to do a subcontracting process. So now let's see what all steps are required in a subcontracting process. So as a first step, you need to create a subcontracting PO line item with item category as L, and then you need to maintain the components against the PO line item. Now you'll create this PO through T Code ME2O. Then once you have created the PO, you will have to issue the components to the subcontractor. The movement type would be 541, and you will do this particular transaction through T Code ME2O. And as you can see here, no financial entries will get posted during this step. That is, issuing the components to the vendor will not lead to any financial entry, because you are simply transferring your stock to the vendor's warehouse. The stock belongs to your plant. Now, once the vendor has done the service activity, then vendor will supply you the finished goods, and you will receive these finished goods through GR. The movement type can be 101 or 105 depending upon how you're doing the goods receipt. And this particular activity will then lead to consumption of the raw materials. Okay. The raw materials that you issue to the vendor in the previous process, those will get consumed during the GR of your finished goods. And the movement type would be 543O. and you will do this particular GR through T Code ME2O. Now at this process, the financial entries will happen and all the financial documents will get posted at this step only. So the three steps are: you have to create the purchase order line item with item category L, you have to issue the components to the vendor, and you have to receive the finished product and consume the components through a single GR step. So now let's see what all financial entries will get posted when you do GR of your finished product. So basically this goods receipt involves three steps that happen simultaneously. That is the goods receipt of finished goods, the consumption of the raw material, and the service charges. Okay, all these three financial entries will get posted in a single GR. So for GR of finished goods, you will have a debit entry for the inventory of the finished good. The transaction key would be BSX. Then you have a credit entry in the inventory of the raw material. That is, the raw material will get consumed and inventory will get removed. And again, the transaction key would be BSX. And then your GRIR account will get a credit entry for payment to the vendor. That is, this GRIR account you will clear during the ME2O process. The transaction key would be WRX. And for all these three entries, you will have an offsetting entry. Okay, so for GR of finished goods, you will have a credit entry against the subcon stock change GL. The transaction key for this particular GL would be BSV. For consumption of the raw material, you will have a consumption account getting a debit entry. The transaction key would be GBB. And for the service charges, you will have a debit entry in the service expense account that you will maintain against transaction key FRL. So in totality, you have 6 lines getting posted in the GR of a subcontracting purchase order. You have 3 pairs of entries. One is for GR of finished goods, one is consumption of raw material, and one is for service charges. And on the screen, you can see what all financial entries will get posted. Okay, so I hope that you've understood the whole subcontracting process and what all steps are involved and what all financial entries will get posted. Now let us see in SAP how we can create a subcontracting purchase order, and then how we can do these activities, and then we'll verify the financial entries that get posted when we do the GR of the finished good. So let's start. So now let's start in SAP. So in our first step, what we'll do is we'll create a subcontracting PO. So we'll go to T Code ME21N. Then we'll enter the vendor code, the purchase organization, purchase group, and company code. And here we'll enter the finished goods, that is the painted bicycle that we have to receive from the subcontracting vendor. Okay, so we'll enter the material code of the finished goods, and here we have to enter the item category as L. If you take a drop down in this column, you can see that item category L is for subcontracting. Okay, so let's select this item category. Then we have to enter the quantity that we want to receive from the vendor. That is the painted bicycles that we'll be receiving from the subcontracting vendor. So let's enter some quantity here. Then in this particular field, we'll enter the price that has been quoted by the vendor for the service activity. In this case, this is for the painting of the bicycles. Okay, so let's enter some value here, and let's enter the plant code here, and we'll press enter. Now you see system gives you an error that not possible to determine any components. Because you have entered item category as L, system is asking you to enter component for this particular finished good. To enter the component, we can go to the material data tab and we can click this particular button here. Now this button will only come when you enter the item category as L in the PO line item. So let's click this components button. Now here in this table, we have to enter all the components in their particular quantities which will be required to produce the finished goods. Okay. In this case, we have only the raw bicycles which will be then painted and will be provided as a finished good as a painted bicycle. So right now what we'll do is we'll enter the raw material, that is the raw bicycles, and we'll enter the same quantity which we entered in the main line item, that is the 10 quantity. And then we'll go back. And now that we have maintained the components, we'll click on save and we'll save our purchase order. Now you can see this purchase order has been created. So now in the next step, what we have to do is we have to issue this particular material to the subcontracting vendor. So to issue the components to the vendor, we'll go to T Code ME2O, and here we'll enter the vendor code and the components which are to be provided to this particular vendor. So in this case, it will be the raw bicycles. So we'll enter the material code for raw bicycles and we'll execute. Now system will list all the subcontracting purchase order against which this component has been maintained with this particular vendor code. So you can see here our created subcontracting purchase order has come up here, and to issue the components we have to select this line item and we have to click on post goods issue. Now here you can change the quantity, that is if you want to issue partial quantities, that is let's say that you want to issue only 5 raw bicycles to the vendor and get them painted, then you will enter that particular quantity to issue to the subcontracting vendor. Okay, so we'll enter quantity as 5 here, and we have to enter the storage location in which the component stock is lying. So let's first check the stock of the component. So to check the stock, we'll go to MMBE. So to check the stock, we'll go to T Code MMBE. And here you will enter the component and the plant and we'll execute. So you can see here 95 quantity is available in storage location 0001. So we can issue this quantity to the subcontractor. So again, we'll go to this particular transaction ME2O. We'll select this line, click on post goods issue. And here you can change the quantity and enter the storage location in which the component is lying and then click on OK. So you can see here one item has been posted, that is component has been issued to the vendor. If you want to see the material document, then you can go to transaction MB51 and you can execute this. So you can see here this particular entry we have just now posted. If we double click here, we can go to this material document, and if you go to the FI document button, you get a message that no subsequent document has been found in accounting. As we have discussed that when you issue the component to the vendor, no financial entry happens. So at this stage, no financial document will get posted. The stock will be shown against the plant stock only, but with a subcontracting vendor assignment. Okay. So let's see the stock in MMBE again. So if we'll go to MMBE and if we execute, you can see that 5 quantity has been sent to the subcontractor, and you see here stock provided to vendor, and 90 is there in the unrestricted stock. So earlier you had 95 quantity, out of which 5 has been issued to the vendor. If you double click here, you can find the vendor code against which this component has been issued. But still this particular stock belongs to the plant on financial basis. Okay. Now to see the subcontracting stock only, we can go to T Code MBLB also. So if we go to T Code MBLB, and if you enter the supplier code here and the components code here, and if you execute, you can see the 5 quantities lying at this particular vendor's warehouse. Okay, this 508 is the vendor code and 5 quantities lying at the subcontractor warehouse for the particular service activity. Okay, and the value also you can see here is the value of the inventory. This particular stock you can also see in the transaction code MB52. So if you go to T Code MB52, and to see this stock, you have to have this particular checkbox activated. When you issue the component to the subcontractor, system creates a special stock with special stock indicator O. So if we execute this particular transaction here, then we can see 90 is lying in the unrestricted stock and 5 is lying with this particular vendor with special stock indicator O. Now this particular stock is essential when we do the GR, because consumption will happen from special stock O only. Okay, whenever you post the GR of finished goods, system will post the raw material from this particular special stock only. So in our third step, what we'll do is we'll post the GR of the finished goods. So to do that, we'll go to T Code MyGo. Then we'll select goods receipt, then purchase order, and this time we'll enter the purchase order here and press enter. So you see here 10 quantities from the PO is coming here. Now to receive partial quantity, we'll change the quantity here. So we are receiving 5 painted bicycles from the vendor. Now if you click on this particular button here, then system will show you all the components which are part of this particular finished good. So you can see here one component is here, the raw bicycles, with quantity is 5 here. Okay, system has automatically changed the quantity for raw bicycles as per the finished goods quantity that you have changed here. So now we'll enter the storage location and then we'll post this particular GR. So you see here the material document has been posted. Now let's display this document. So we'll go to the FI document to see any financial entries that has happened against this particular material document. So if you click on FI documents, now you see accounting document has been created. So as we discussed, when you do GR of the finished good, then only the accounting document will get created. So let's see this accounting document. So as we have discussed, you will have 6 lines of entry in this accounting document, which will have 3 pairs of entry. One is for GR of the finished goods, one is for consumption of the raw material, and the third one is for the service charges. So if you see here, this particular line is the debit entry for inventory of finished good, that is the painted bicycle, and this particular entry is the offsetting entry to this, that is the subcontracting stock change entry. Okay. Now if you want to see the transaction keys also, let's just keep this transaction keys here. So you see this inventory posting happened against transaction key BSX, and this particular entry is against transaction key BSV. So this is the entry for the GR of the finished good. Then these two entry that you see here, this is the credit entry against the raw material consumption against the transaction key BSX. So the inventory has been removed for the raw material, and this particular entry is the consumption entry which has happened against this entry. Okay, and the transaction key is GBB. And these two entries that you see here, this is the GRIR credit entry against which the Miro transaction will happen and the vendor liability will get created. And this is the offsetting entry to this particular GRIR entry. So you have transaction key WRX against the GRIR entry, and you have FRL for the service charges. So as we discussed, you have 3 pairs of entries. One is for GR of the finished goods, that is BSX and BSV. Then you have consumption of the raw material, that is BSX and GBB, and then you have posting of service charges, which is WRX and FRL. So these are 6 lines of entries in this accounting document which we had discussed earlier. Now this particular entry, if you see the value here, we had entered the service charges 50 rupees. If you go to the purchase order, let's see. So if you go to the purchase order, you can see 50 rupees for the service charge. So for 5 quantity, you will have 250 rupees entry, and you can see here in the GRIR entry, you have 250 rupees entry here. This entry you will use in the Miro transaction to create the vendor liability. So let's do that. So we'll go to transaction code Miro. Then we'll enter the purchase order number. And as you can see here, this 250 rupees entry has come up here, against which we'll create the vendor liability. So we'll enter the same amount here also. We'll enter the baseline date. And then we'll simulate. So you can see here on simulating, you can see that the vendor liability is getting created, and this particular GRIR account clearing is happening here. So a debit entry of 250 rupees in GRIR account, and this GRIR account will get cleared, and a liability against the vendor will get created. So let's post this. So you can see here the Miro document has been posted, and if you want to see this document, then you can see in the purchase order history also. So let's go to the PO and see the purchase order history. So you see here in the PO history, you have this GR document and this Miro document. If you go to the Miro document and then go to the FI documents, then you can see here the vendor liability has been created and the GRIR account has been cleared. So as you can see that we have paid the vendor for the service charges, and we have done the inventory management also through the subcontracting process, that we were able to issue the components to the vendor and receive the finished goods. So this is the whole process of subcontracting purchase order. I hope that you have understood this process and you have understood the financial entries also which happen through this process. Now let us dive into some of the interview questions which are related to the subcontracting process. So now let's see some of the questions related to the subcontracting PO process. So our first question would be, what is the item category to create a subcontracting PO? So the answer would be that the item category to create the subcontracting PO is item category L. You select this item category to create a subcontracting PO line item, and because of this item category only you are able to add components to your finished good PO line item. Okay. Now the next question is, what are the movement types involved in subcontracting PO process? So there are 3 movement types which are involved. One is the goods issue of component to the subcontractor. The movement type would be 541. Then you have goods receipt of finished goods. The movement type is 101 or 105 depending upon how you're doing the GR. Then you have consumption of the components during the GR process. The movement type would be 543O. Then the third question is, does any financial entry happen during issue of components to the subcontractor? The answer is no. No financial entries happen during issue of components. The financial entry will only happen when you post the GR of the finished goods against the subcontracting PO. Then the fourth question is, what are the financial entries posted during GR of finished goods? And the answer is that there are three pairs of financial entries that will happen. One is the GR of the finished goods, then the consumption of the raw materials, and the service charges entry. Then the fifth question is, what are the transaction keys involved during posting of GR against the subcontracting PO? So against those three entries, you have against GR of finished goods, the transaction keys would be BSX and BSV. For consumption of raw materials, the transaction keys are BSX and GBB. And for service charges, the transaction keys are WRX and FRL. So you should have GL maintained against all these transaction keys so that your GR of the finished goods should happen against the subcontracting PO. So this is all about the subcontracting PO process. I have covered everything which is part of the subcontracting PO process, and I have shown how you can do this process in SAP. And we have seen some of the questions related to the subcontracting process. I hope that you have liked this video. If you like my videos, then please subscribe to my channel. Thanks a lot for supporting me. Thank you.